Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Ben Rhodes. I'm the Senior Vice President with CAMS. We have Kevin Giles with us today to talk about seeing what you can't see, or what to expect, and how to budget for it. So, timely conversation about this topic, unfortunately, with the tragedy in Florida. When we first started planning this seminar, we were focused more on budgeting, but as this came together, we thought that we should also touch on well, things to look for in your budget planning and how to reduce some liability. So again, we'll go through a lot of that information, and hopefully we will know how to plan for the future. So today, or not today, but this year is our 30th anniversary. So as part of our 30th anniversary, we are doing a drawing. So we want to thank you all for joining us today. So by joining, you are automatically entered into a drawing. I just lost my screen, so give me 1 second. I know Connie Daniel with Willows in Leland was our lucky winner from last month's drawing. She's winning a $100 Amex gift card. So everybody, again, will be entered at the end of our presentation today for that $100 Amex drawing. So again, thank you. We will be doing Q&A throughout the session. So if you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of the chats or the Zoom screen, and we will answer those questions. If they are relative to the topic that Kevin is speaking on, I'll try and jump in and ask those questions, but most likely we'll hold most of the questions till the end of the presentation today. For next month's webinar, we are going to be doing that on the second week of the month instead of the third week of the month. We do have our annual conference in Las Vegas that a number of us will be attending. So next month's topic will be on the 10 mistakes that board members make. So if you're interested in joining that webinar, it will be done on August 12th. So Kevin, I will turn it over to you. Awesome. And to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. We appreciate the opportunity to present this afternoon. Again, I'm Kevin Giles, Giles Flythe Engineers. We do engineering evaluations, structural engineering evaluations, and reserve studies for condominium and townhome and homeowner associations throughout North and South Carolina. We have 17 people on staff. I want to quickly get through the legal stuff. This is not intended as engineering advice or design or consultation for any particular incident. I am not a licensed professional engineer. We have 10 licensed professional engineers on staff. And we've been talking a lot about some of the incidents of late from Florida, the tragic collapse of that building down in Florida. You can imagine in our office, it's been a very popular topic. We had a staff meeting yesterday, and we spent a good bit of time talking about what all of us have read about what led up to those incidents. It's a little bit premature. There will certainly be more findings coming out as to exactly what happened and why the building did collapse. But first and foremost, I mean, our thoughts and prayers go out to the families affected by that event. And I know there's a loss of life and just a very tragic event. But today we've been asked to kind of speak about planning for the unexpected, how to know maybe those things that are unexpected and how to plan for them, how to budget for those things. And one of the things that we will be talking about is structural problems with buildings and that type of thing. So let me share my screen and we will jump right into planning for the unexpected. Perfect. So we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to start out with discussing a lot of the things that are unexpected, what we see in terms of community associations and condominium associations, what you are facing that you might not be planning for, what we see some communities face in terms of large expenses that may not be in a reserve study, may not be in an annual budget, may not be one of those planned for type of expenses. So when we're looking at unexpected expenses that we see communities face, a couple different categories. Number one, the uninsured damage, uninsured storm damage. So if something happens, there's a storm event, a hurricane, a tornado, or whatever type of event, there are certain parts of that damage that may not be insured. For example, cleaning up trees and brush and vegetation and anything that's blown around on common areas. If you have private streets in your community and you have a bunch of trees that fall over those private streets during a hurricane event, most likely that activity would not be funded by insurance. Insurances typically want to have a structure or some sort of building or structure that is being insured. And if your trees just fall across the street, it's not going to be covered by most insurance type policies. Sometimes flood insurance can be one of those things. If you do not have flood insurance and there is a flood that damages some of the common area buildings or structures, that is another thing that may not be covered by insurance. Another part of this unexpected or possible gap would be if you have a insurance policy. This is more applicable to high-rise condominiums, maybe large clubhouses as well. Usually you will have a named storm deductible on that insurance policy. So if the damage to the building is the result of a named hurricane or named tropical storm, you could have a very high deductible, 1% to 10% of insured value. For a very large condominium building, I mean, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in a deductible. So that is another kind of gap between what's in a reserve study versus what's in an operating budget versus what's covered by insurance. There's a chunk of funds there that would not be covered by any three of those things. One of the other areas that we'll talk about more at length is the failure of what we would typically call a long life component. So when you have a reserve study completed for your community, they're going to be estimating capital repair expenses over a 20-year or 30-year term. There are a lot of things with regard to your infrastructure and your buildings that are assumed to have a useful life longer than 20 or 30 years. For example, the structural components, your concrete structures, your footings, the framing for the building, all of those are basically assumed to be 50 to 100-year or even longer life components. But what happens when those components start deteriorating before that long life? How can you plan for that? What should you be looking for to help you plan for that? Another unexpected thing that we see a lot of communities faced with is new ordinances from various states and governments to also municipalities. For example, many years ago, I think it was 2012, there was a fire at a apartment complex in the city of Raleigh, and it was attributed somewhat to pine straw in front of the buildings. And the city of Raleigh immediately passed a local ordinance that no pine straw should be installed around multifamily buildings. So all of the townhome communities townhome and condo communities within the city of Raleigh immediately had this expense of removing all the pine straw and installing mulch or some other ground cover around their buildings. Rapid inflation is another unexpected, something that's not necessarily planned for. Your reserve study provider will typically factor in a assumed rate of inflation, but oftentimes if we enter into a market where inflation is much, much higher than that, that would be an unexpected expense. And then there's a lot of other non-repair type expenses, lawsuits, fines, attorney expenses, paying to defend the association that may not be covered under insurance, depending on the policy. And then also, as we all saw last year, expenses associated with responding to a pandemic as well. So we're going to talk about these unexpected expenses, primarily focusing on the failure of those long life components. And then we're also going to talk about how to plan and how to budget for those expenses. So how can you know that you have some amount of funds available, that you have some resources available, what resources you can use to help cover those types of expenses. So we'll talk about uninsured storm damage. I am not an insurance professional. CAMS works with plenty of insurance professionals that can certainly help you with these particulars, with what is covered by insurance and what is not covered by insurance. However, I have sat through plenty of insurance education seminars through CAI and then also through just insurance professionals in this industry. Your insurance for your buildings are typically going to require two things. Number one, an insured event has to happen. So something has to happen. It's not typically going to cover long-term deterioration, so gradual deterioration in components. And then the second thing, the damaged building or structure has to be something that is listed as insured. So there's a couple gaps that can happen in this. Number one, we talked about that long-term deterioration. So if over a long period of time you have concrete spalling and damage to foundation settlement or you start to get rust developing in components, or you have deterioration in framing or even plumbing supply piping sometimes. And it's a slow, gradual process. Typically, insurance would deny that property damage claim because it is a long-term deterioration. It's not an event. There was not a storm event. There was not a hurricane. There was not any event. There was not a fire. There was not some sort of event that led to it. And then the second thing is that component, that's building, that infrastructure needs to be listed as an insured component. There's some gaps that we see sometimes in insurance policies, that certain things that are in common areas may or may not be listed on an insurance policy. For example, retaining walls is a big one. So some communities that we've worked with will have retaining walls listed and some won't. That's just a gap you should be aware of. I'm not necessarily saying that you should absolutely have all retaining walls on your insurance policy. However, if you don't have them on your insurance policy, it's something you should certainly be aware of, that you have that exposure to that risk. Stormwater ponds and pond infrastructure is almost never included on insurance policies. I don't even know if they would insure a stormwater pond under a typical insurance policy. Also falling trees and debris on roads and landscaped areas and those types of things. Again, that's another thing that's not typically included. Insurance signs usually make it to the insurance policies, and certainly any buildings should be covered by the property damage insurance as well. And then flood insurance, that's a very specific thing to specific areas. Just because you got a survey or when you bought the property, your lender said you didn't have to have it. Flood zones do change periodically depending on various circumstances. You may want to be purchasing flood insurance even if you're outside of technically a flood zone. And then we've also seen insurance companies deny claims due to poor installation or defects in construction as well. If something was built wrong and that's why it failed, as opposed to the storm damage, that can be a denied claim. So these would be unexpected expenses, unexpected things that are going to happen, stuff that, well, we thought insurance was going to cover it, but it turns out they don't. So here are just some things to keep in mind with regard to where that gap may be, the uninsured components that you as a board may be responsible for maintaining that are in common areas for that homeowner association. Clubhouses, condominium buildings, those that common area infrastructure. The second unexpected thing I want to spend a little bit more time on is the failure of long life components, right? So these components that your reserve study provider may have had a paragraph in the report that said there are plenty of retaining walls in the community. Those have an expected useful life well beyond the term of the study. We have not allocated funds for repairing or replacing any retaining walls. So that is like a long-term, a long life component. And your reserve study provider is generally correct that what you see in this picture is a segmental block retaining wall, mechanical stabilized earth, technically is what's called MSE wall. So there's a geogrid fabric that's installed behind it to hold those blocks in place. And technically, yes, this would be a permanent structure, right? This would be designed to be a permanent component. That has a lot of assumptions behind it. Number one, that it was installed correctly, it was designed correctly, and that the drainage systems around that retaining wall are maintained correctly. Assuming those three things, yes, it is going to have an expected useful life of 100+ years, right? I mean, it's concrete blocks. At the end of the day, it's just concrete blocks and a synthetic fabric that's holding it in place. There's nothing there that's going to really deteriorate over any significant amount of period of time. This particular example that you're seeing photos of, this is a failed wall. This was about a 15-foot tall retaining wall that was sitting below a parking lot. The picture on the left you see is just where it has failed and all the blocks have fallen into the woods below that. That black line you see right there is actually the aluminum fence that was on top of the wall that went down with the wall when it failed. It was a result of inadequate drainage systems installed behind the wall. And I don't think that the geogrid was installed correctly as well behind the wall, but these are all things you wouldn't be able to see. You would walk up to this wall and you wouldn't necessarily be able to know that the systems were installed incorrectly behind that wall. This was right near the parking lot. So you can see on that picture on the right, that is actually a section of the parking lot that had started settling as soon as this wall failed and started to almost want to fall down into the little embankment below that. So they broke off a section of that parking lot to prevent anybody from accessing that. But these retaining walls, yes, I mean, in theory, they should have a permanent kind of life. It should be a 50 to 100 year plus expected useful life, but we've certainly seen these fail. Everybody's very concerned, and rightfully so, about the news from Florida about this building collapse that has happened in Florida. I can tell you it is very rare that a building in the United States is going to completely collapse without some sort of event, right? Without some sort of earthquake, sinkhole, some sort of event. This is probably the first time in 50 years that a building of that caliber, maybe longer than that, a building of that size has just absolutely collapsed on its own without any event that was attributed to it. Retaining wall failure, like in these photos though, this is something that we see in our office probably once a year. We see some sort of retaining wall failure. Maybe it's a community, maybe it's a commercial building, some sort of retaining wall failure is much, much more common. We've had a lot of phone calls over the past couple of weeks in our office. I can understand some of the concerns. I just want to bring a little bit of kind of logic into this, that the risk of a retaining wall failure would be much higher than a complete building failure. I mean, it's a very rare occurrence that a building is going to collapse. It appears from at least the early news reports that there's been previous engineering studies on this particular building and the corrosion on that particular building down in Miami for many years, that they've been aware of structural problems for many years. It appears that there were repairs recommended and even imminently recommended by engineers that were not completed. There's a lot of things, a long process that led into this deterioration before that building did collapse. If you haven't had any issues with your building, you've never seen any problems with your buildings, I would not say that there's any major reason for concern immediately. Oh, is our building going to fall down tomorrow? That would not be a very logical response to this. Now, yeah, I just want to say that up front. I think the best guidance that I can provide with response to that is, if you have had previous engineering reports completed on your building, go back and reread them and make sure you have done the repairs that were done to those buildings that were recommended. Make sure that you're doing what was recommended. If you've had an engineer look at your building in the past several years, go reread that report and go read what the recommendations were and make sure that work was done correctly. And if you have any doubt, call the engineer that was out there the first time to look at it and have them come back out and confirm that the work was done correctly. Usually home inspection reports, when you have units that are bought and sold, they're going to be identifying possible structural problems inside the units, sloping floors, interior drywall cracks, a whole bunch of things that are going to be gradually happening leading up to any major type collapse or failure of a building. There's a lot of things that would typically happen before a building is just going to collapse. And we have some slides in here in a minute, more specific about reinforced concrete construction, kind of help teach you a little bit about what to look for. This is another retaining wall collapse. This one was very interesting. We were, and these are not CAMS properties, by the way. None of the properties that we have in our photos today are CAMS properties. These are other communities that we have worked with. But this was an interesting property because that photo on the left and that photo on the right are about 6 months apart. The photo on the left, you have your standard segmental block retaining wall. Looks to be in pretty decent shape, no major concerns, maybe a little bit of unevenness, but there's no glaring issue with this retaining wall. About 6 months later, after a big storm event, and it was one of those kind of stacked storm events where you had rain for like 3 solid days, and then one more big storm rain event after that, the wall completely collapsed and fell out into the parking lot on the right. Fortunately, no one was injured. I think there was minimal damage to any vehicles at the time. It just basically was very fortunate that there was not anybody parked there, any issues with anyone around that area. So yeah, so this particular retaining wall is an interesting story in that we were literally on site 6 months prior to that complete collapse. But again, it's the unseen components. It's that geogrid reinforcement that was not installed on this particular wall. You would not necessarily see it if it had been installed. It's a hidden component, and after the failure, you can clearly see that there was not the geogrid fabric reinforcement behind it, and then also the drainage systems were not adequately installed behind the wall as well. Let's talk about the reinforced concrete construction. So it appears from at least the early reports that the building that collapsed down in Miami was what we would call reinforced concrete construction. So the structural components were concrete reinforced with rebar. This is an example of an oceanfront building in South Carolina, I believe, that we've worked on. The bottom of this building, so this is a typical 3-story wood frame structure, but it is installed on concrete columns, reinforced concrete columns. Those white vertical columns you see in the photo, that is reinforced concrete columns. If you've ever been to a beach in North Carolina or South Carolina, you've probably seen a building that looks very similar to this. This is quite common construction. They must have built thousands of these back in the 80s in North and South Carolina. So yeah, and this is a 30, I think it was a 35-year-old, I think it was built in 84 or something like that, or approximately 35-year-old building, oceanfront building in South Carolina. And this is just a general view. This is some of the spalling that happened in the concrete. So the concrete columns are, I'll show you on the slide in a minute exactly how the concrete columns are constructed. There's basically steel rebar. There's a web of steel rebar that is designed and then installed, and then they pour the concrete around the rebar. The purpose of the rebar is to help strengthen the concrete, reduce cracking, and help strengthen the concrete. Over a long period of time, moisture will penetrate through concrete. If that moisture contains salt with it, it's even worse, but the steel rebar inside the concrete will begin to corrode. As that steel rebar begins to corrode, it can lead to cracking, spalling, and problems with the concrete. So that's what you see. This is a symptom. So this is something, if you have a reinforced concrete building and you see something like this in this photo, you need to have an engineer come look at it. Doesn't necessarily mean that building is going to fall anytime soon, but if you see this type of issue in a reinforced concrete structure, if you see that cracking, spalling, pieces of concrete falling off, you'll see a reddish tint in some of the concrete as well. Let me see if I can find, but you'll see a red type color develop, that iron color develop in the concrete as well. But these are some typical spalling. On this one, the whole corner of a column had fallen off. A chunk of that concrete had fallen off for this particular column. Again, here's some more spalling that has happened in that concrete column. These are the symptoms to be to look for. I mean, I would like to think a layman, any person could look at this and tell you, hey, something's not right. This is not what it's supposed to look like. So if you see this on your buildings, this would be a cause for concern. This particular building had an engineered plan in place to how to repair all of these columns. They had already established a funding. They'd already had budgeted funds to come out of the reserves to fix it. They actually had to prioritize the repairs. So the worst columns were going to get fixed first. And then due to funding constraints, they were going to delay the secondary columns another year or two that didn't have this bad of spalling on it. Over a period of time, they were going to be replacing or repairing these columns. And there are some repair options that are pretty reasonable for fixing these types of things. To prevent this in oceanfront environments, keeping those columns painted will certainly help. That's probably the best prevention method is to keep those columns painted and those exposed concrete surfaces painted and covered with a good coating to prevent that moisture from intruding to begin with, would be your best prevention. But if you see this, it's certainly a structural problem. So this concrete in theory would be another long life component, right? These are reinforced concrete construction. This is something that would have a 50, 100-year plus expected useful life, something that we would not generally anticipate to see premature failure. Now, if it's in a coastal community and you're working with a reserve study provider that's very experienced, yeah, they are probably going to have seen this before and they're going to start recommending that as you kind of approach that year 30, year 40, you're likely going to start seeing some of those components. If you're in an inland building, upstate South Carolina, Columbia, Greenville, Charlotte markets, less exposure to that salt air, to that salt water, we would generally consider those to be permanent structures. We would not anticipate any major repairs to those components over a 50 to 100-year life for reinforced concrete construction. So again, these are just some examples, some photos of those components. The construction for that building in Miami was reinforced concrete. So it's the same type of construction as this. The next 3 photos or 4 photos, I'm going to show you how these columns are constructed. This is from a different project that we worked on. There was a new construction project that was using reinforced concrete columns. In this photo, you can see that rebar has been set up. So they've built their rebar cage that they call it. So that cage, that rebar layout is designed by an engineer. The size of the rebar, the spacing of the rebar, how all of this works is kind of designed by an engineer. After the rebar cage is built, they build the formwork to go around the rebar. So you can see these wood boards, these 2x4s are holding the formwork in place, and then they're angularly braced back down to the concrete slab. So it's going to hold that formwork in place so that we can pour the concrete into that formwork. This is looking down. This photo is looking down onto a column from above. In this photo, we're pouring the concrete into the formwork, into that column. That hose coming from the sky right there is attached to a concrete pumping truck that is pumping the concrete into that column. And those workers there are holding that hose in place. There's usually a vibrator that's installed to make sure that the concrete fills out all of the empty air pockets within that formwork as well. And then after it's done, this is a different area of the same project. You can see basically rebar sticking out of this reinforced concrete wall that looks like this was a foundation wall. But once it's done, you pull the formwork off and you have a column left on there. I see a question on here that popped up about a 50 to 100 year lifespan for retaining walls seems to be way over optimistic. I would certainly agree for wood retaining walls. Any wood retaining walls we see, certainly a 20-year life on a wood retaining wall. The way we approach it for reserve studies with retaining walls is if there's a significant volume of the segmental block retaining walls that would pose a significant amount of risk to a community, we're certainly going to allocate some funds for those repairs. We're certainly going to be putting those funds in there. However, we've certainly seen plenty of segmental block retaining walls. I think the technology is about 30 to 40 years old now. I started using it in the early 80s, I believe. We've certainly seen plenty of communities with segmental block retaining walls that have had no movement, no deflection, no cracking, no apparent deterioration whatsoever, and they're already at year 30 or 40. There's nothing to suggest. I mean, it's a stable component. I mean, it's a concrete. It's a stable component. So depending on the retaining wall type and construction, will depend on what we estimate the estimated life to be for retaining walls. Moving forward a little bit, there's a whole bunch of other long life components that an association should at least be aware of when you're doing your reserve studies. If you have these components, if these components are common areas, these are some things that you should be taking an active role in your reserve study process to make sure that you're being covered for these things, or at least aware of them, so you can at least know what the risk is that you're assuming as an association. Foundations and framing components. So again, a wood framed house or a foundation, a center block CMU foundation wall, these are generally accepted as permanent structures, right? We've got plenty of houses built in the early 1900s, wood framed houses that are still standing today, well over 100 years in age. These foundations and framing systems are generally supposed to be permanent. However, depending on soil conditions, depending on various factors, you could certainly have settlement in foundation walls that would require stabilization or other types of repairs. Depending on framing situations, I mean, we all know termites can certainly wreak havoc on framing, wood framing. If you have crawl spaces that your association is responsible for, so like if you have a 3-story stacked condominium building and then the bottom floor has crawl spaces underneath it, typically in governing documents, those crawl spaces would then become common areas that the association would be responsible for because it's not inside the envelope that is defined as a unit. Crawl spaces can be neglected. That's one of those gap areas that we oftentimes see where no one ever goes in it, no one worries about it, and then a home inspector at some point down the road goes into it and discovers standing water, mold, and rotted wood. So something to be aware of. Balconies are another difficult area. We've seen a lot of balcony failures in the past 5, 10, 15 years, especially concrete balconies that are poured on top of wood framing. There's very particular waterproofing systems that have to be installed to protect those balconies. Wood decks, I put it on here. We would always, as a reserve study provider, we would always assume that a wood deck is going to have an expected useful life, typically 20 years or so, depending on where it's at and what types of situations we see around it. Stormwater ponds, dams, outlet structures. If you have a community with that old farm pond that was there 50 years ago and has a whole bunch of trees on the earthen dam, that could be a pretty significant risk. Whenever we see ponds that have large trees on the earthen dam, I try to tell my board members and the communities we work with, just envision if you've ever lived through a hurricane in North or South Carolina, when you see those trees that fall over, you see the size of that root ball that comes with those trees. I mean, after Hurricane Hugo in Charlotte, I can remember there's a picture of me as a kid standing in a hole that was in our front yard that was probably 4 feet deep, and the root ball was probably 10 feet in diameter. This massive oak tree had fallen over. If that happens on an earthen dam for a pond, and you lose that huge cavity of earth pulling out of that earthen dam, you could easily have a failure of that earthen dam in a stormwater pond or an old farm pond. Again, that's something that might be overlooked in a reserve study, something that at least you should be aware of regarding that. I see a question popped up. So it is the board of directors' ultimate responsibility to find any building problems, not the management company, insurance company, etc. How often should we budget for inspections, specifically structural? Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, as a board of directors, you are, again, I'm not an attorney, but you are generally tasked with the maintenance and operation of the buildings. Most of the communities we work with regard to inspection seem to rely a lot on the home inspection reports that they receive. So when units are sold and a home inspector comes in and identifies problems, there's a punch list, there's things that the HOA is responsible for. Your reserve study provider every 3 to 5 years should be inspecting the buildings, taking a look at the components that the association is responsible for. I would generally recommend, especially for our inland communities, if you are doing a reserve study every 3 to 5 years and you are keeping an eye on any home inspection reports that come in, and you have other vendors, maintenance contractors on site that haven't cited anything unusual, I think you would be fine with that protocol. Doing the reserve study every 3 to 5 years, keeping an eye on the buildings through just general walk-arounds by maybe a committee or maybe the board of directors. Generally looking at it. Now, if you're in an oceanfront building, the deterioration factor is just so much greater, especially if that building's already 20, 30 years in age, then it might be a lot smarter to enter in some sort of either annual or biannual type inspection protocol where you have somebody coming out to do an inspection routinely of the building. If you have really large retaining walls, we would typically recommend those to be inspected at least once a year. Large retaining walls being over 8 to 10 feet in height, being a significant length and quantity, so 100 foot by 10 feet in height. Something that the large quantity of retaining walls, and in our opinion, it would be worth the expense to have an inspection of those done. There's a lot of things that you can see in a retaining wall that may be premature, maybe signs of premature failure, premature problems that you can address before you get to a failure. Other long life components, we'll talk about those. Buried utility piping, buried stormwater piping. Many of you, if you're in a condominium or townhome community that's over about 30 years, 40 years in age, and you have, especially if you have cast iron sewer pipes that are in common areas, you've probably already started repairing those. Those are things that you can't necessarily see. We do, for those types of communities, that older stormwater infrastructure or older buried utility piping, you can do video borescope inspections, and that's something that we typically recommend as part of our reserve studies. Usually a good commercial plumber can do it. They basically running a camera snake through the piping to do a visual inspection to see what the inside of that pipe looks like, since you can't see it from above ground. Another one we get asked a lot is regarding landscaping overhaul, tree removal, replacement. You can certainly see it happening. That's usually a more gradual type thing, but something that can be a gap in your reserve study, may or may not be in the reserve study. And there's several arborists and tree professionals that can actually provide reserve studies for trees, if that's a very big part of your common area responsibilities. So there's a lot of different long life components that could start to fail that you should at least be aware of if you have in your community. Another surprise or unexpected expense can be new ordinances. A couple ordinances that are most common would be the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. You've probably, if you've been through enough of these webinars, you've probably heard at least a webinar or two about accessibility and what an association's requirement is for meeting accessibility standards, even if they were grandfathered in and the buildings were built beforehand. So there could be some surprise expenses regarding making your older buildings now accessible. Fire suppression systems. The state of Florida has actually been in about a 15 or 20 year kind of court battle with forcing older buildings to retrofit their buildings with fire suppression systems. So if the building was built in the 70s or 80s and did not have fire sprinklers, state of Florida is now pushing that those buildings get fire suppression systems installed. Pond dam hazard ratings. So in North Carolina, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the state went through and reset the rules with what they're labeling in terms of dam hazards. So your pond that your community owns and maintains has an earthen dam on it, and the state of North Carolina considered it to be a low hazard. It was changed to possibly medium hazard or high hazard dam, which then required emergency action plans and a bunch of other things. So that's another possible new ordinance that may have a surprise type of expense. And then local governments, we've seen everything from pool fencing to electrical systems of swimming pools have new rules where the pool fences had to be 3 feet tall. Well, this year they have to be 4 feet tall, or electrical systems have to be inspected. The pine straw example I talked about, we've seen a municipality push fire hydrants onto associations where it was previously assuming responsibility, and then it declared it as no longer responsible for fire hydrants. Just several things to be aware of. Your managers at CAMS would probably be best aware of any local government type ordinances, and also your vendors and the people that you're contracting, your service providers would be most aware of those. A couple of questions popped up. Let's see here. We are across oceanfront, second row. Any items we should look for on wood pylon structures as opposed to concrete and rebar, which are more visible and maybe indications of wear over time? Wood pylons, the most common failure that we see in that wood framing underneath buildings in oceanfront type properties or even a block off the ocean is the fasteners. So your bolts and your bracing are oftentimes metal, steel bolts, and we'll see significant corrosion, rusting, corrosion developing on those fasteners. That can be a very much problematic thing, something that should be fixed. So rusting fasteners are the primary one we see fail. Wood pilings in water environments where they're constantly exposed to water can start to fail from, there's a certain type of worm, there's various insects and things that can start to deteriorate wood pilings that are in constant exposure to water over a long period of time. Beyond that, looking for typical settlement stuff inside the units, right? So floor slope, drywall cracking, uneven flooring, doors that are sticking, that type of thing, that continue to get worse. These are the types of symptoms you could look for in wood framed buildings. Another question's up here. Don't see pull or pull decking on the list of long life components. Why? So yes, swimming pool, pool decking. So a swimming pool is generally a concrete shell. Pool decking is typically comprised of concrete. Yes, we generally assume those to be long life components. The pool plastering, we would assume to have a 10 to 15 year cycle where you'd have to drain the pool and replaster the pool. We have seen some failures at swimming pools, probably we do 200 to 300 reserve studies a year, probably only seen 2 what we would call failures in swimming pools where there's been significant settlement that has required some major renovation work that wasn't planned for. Not that common, but something that could certainly happen. That's a very good point. All right, let's jump over to more kind of summarizing the unexpected, right? So these are the unexpected events, and then we're going to jump into how to mitigate these risks, how to plan for those unforeseen expenses, how to plan for the unexpected, how to plan for the stuff that you can't plan for. So again, uninsured storm damage, so those gaps in insurance where you just need to know what you are not covered for. Failure of long life components. We talked about several different things regarding long-term deterioration, retaining wall structures, and all those other different components. New ordinances is something that we discussed. Rapid inflation. So if we do hit us, if this is not just a temporary inflation, as some of the news seems to be reporting, if this is here as a more permanent, much more rapid inflation, that could certainly cause a problem within your reserve account. And then the other non-repair type expenses, lawsuits, attorney expenses, that type of thing. So these are what I'm calling the unexpected major expenses. So how to plan for it, how to budget for it. Couple different sources. Number one, insurance, right? So talk to your insurance providers, figure out where those gaps are, figure out if you can buy additional coverage, figure out if you feel like you have enough retaining walls to warrant insuring the retaining walls, then maybe you should add those to your insurance policy. Another thing is having margin in your budget. If there's a little bit of extra room in your budget every year, that's going to provide you at least some of that basic margin to give you some flexibility to help cover some of these expenses. A lot of the communities we work with, it just seems to be the goal is to keep the dues as low as possible, reduce the dues, don't ever raise the dues, keep them as low as possible. The buildings are going to continue to deteriorate, the buildings are going to continue to get older, and the cost of materials is going to continue to go up, right? This is always going to happen. The mindset of we need to never raise the dues, I don't see it in governing documents that says the responsibility of the board of directors is to never raise the dues, right? It usually says the responsibility of the board of directors is to maintain, repair, replace, manage the common areas, right? It doesn't say you have to keep the dues as low as absolutely possible. So having some margin in your budget will help fund those kind of unexpected events. The reserve study is a very good tool. I would generally recommend updating the reserve study every 3 to 5 years with a fresh site inspection, get that site inspection component done, and then take an active role in that process, right? Be active in it. Ask the question, ask your reserve study provider, is this covered? Is this covered? Should this be covered? Ask a lot of questions of your reserve study provider just to make sure you fully understand if there are any assumed long life components that may not be within the reserve allocation. The threshold balance. So when you're setting up your funding for your reserve accounts over a long period of time, we'll talk about threshold balances, and I'll show you in a minute what those balances will look like and how you can be setting aside funds to help kind of prepare for the unexpected. But at the end of the day, oftentimes it's going to be special assessments or loans, right? So working with your community manager, working with your bankers, working with your attorneys, figuring out what those processes look like, knowing what those processes look like even before the emergency or unexpected would be pretty smart to have a plan in place that if there is some catastrophic failure of something, we need money, this is what the game plan is going to be. I had a follow-up question. It looks like in wood piling supported structures, fasteners that are exposed show corrosion. Many post fasteners are not visible because they are covered. Are these typically an issue? Typically, if the fastener is not visible because it is completely covered, that means that fastener is also protected from the elements. So it is not exposed to the salt air and salt water as much as an exposed fastener would be. So I would generally say not an issue, but again, keep an eye on other symptoms of structural problems, cracking in drywall, uneven floors, the typical problems that we see in buildings that are moving, that are settling, those typical structural problems. If you are worried about it, you can always get into invasive inspections where you're cutting and removing drywall, you're cutting and removing siding, maybe do a sample area of your building if you're just really concerned about it, where you're just pulling away portions of siding to get to those components to do an inspection, because a lot of them are hidden, something that you would never see. But I can absolutely tell you, this building in Miami had plenty of visible evidence that was identified by engineers and engineering reports over many years of all the symptoms of structural problems with this building. And there have been recommendations for repairing those things, and those have been determined to be imminent and needed right now. So the symptoms were there before any major kind of collapse, major incident. But yeah, I mean, it's something to be aware of and be cognizant of. So funding the unexpected, we talked briefly about the threshold balance. So this is what that looks like. So when we do a reserve study, and whoever your reserve study provider is should be something generally similar to this. They're going to provide some sort of graph showing you your projected reserve fund balance over the 20-year term, showing you how much money you're projected to have, assuming you're following their funding recommendations. We set up a goal with our communities to not only stay above zero, but to stay above what we call a threshold balance. And the dotted line at the bottom of this is where we have established for this particular community, we're recommending an approximately $200,000 threshold balance, that they not drop below that over their projected 20 years. And again, that threshold balance is there to help mitigate the risk of all those unexpected expenses. If a retaining wall fails, it wasn't supposed to, if a repair needs to be done sooner than it was supposed to, if there is sharp rise in inflation beyond what was anticipated, there's a buffer. There's a little bit of a cushion there in that reserve account to help cover that. What should the threshold balance be? The general kind of industry standard would be an average year of capital expenditures. So on average, how much are you spending? So if you take, if you do a 20-year reserve study, what's the total amount over 20 years, and then divide it by 20, right? So what is an average year of expenses projected to be? For our communities that are at the coast, that a little more risk in terms of storm damage, deterioration, and that type of thing, we may be increasing or recommending, and that's a discussion we would have with the board or the community manager. Hey, look, we've assumed this threshold balance. We might recommend going higher than this. Your building's already 20 to 30 years in age. There are some things that could be popping up. There's a pretty good risk there for those. But take an active role in that. But basically, when we're recommending those funding reserve account contributions, we're trying to keep that reserve account above just zero. We don't want you dropping right at zero. We want to set up kind of a threshold buffer in there to help fund some of those, to help mitigate basically the risk of those funding constraints, those unexpected incidents. Check in with your reserve study provider. When you do your next reserve study, they can help you establish exactly what a good threshold balance would be. At the end of the day, there are some things that no one's ever going to plan for. There are some things that are just going to happen. No one ever really planned for this building to fall. No one knew it was going to fall that imminently. If the engineer that was on there last time, I think it was 2018 or 19, thought it was going to fall in 2021, he probably would have recommended evacuating the entire building immediately. I mean, even back in 2018, if he thought there was a chance this thing's going to fall within the next 2 years, he would have recommended evacuating. There's some things that are just going to happen that you're not absolutely planned for. And so, yeah, there's definitely always going to be some risks associated with maintaining these buildings. Again, other tools for help planning for the unexpected. Talk to your community manager. Your managers have a lot of experience with a lot of buildings. Talk to your insurance providers, all your different service providers. Your reserve study provider can be a good source of information, attorneys, engineers, your bankers. Again, it's going to start with your managers, though. Those are the ones that are going to be bringing this volume of experience, and then all these resources, all these professionals that work with your type of buildings that can help with that. These are just other individuals that can help planning for those unexpected events.
Hey,
question popped up. Yes, go ahead, Ben.
One question, or at least an area that I think you might want to talk a little bit about. A number of our communities have reserve studies. How deep do those reserve studies go into understanding, maybe what's underneath the surface, and where should the reserve study stop and an engineer report get started?
Yep, that's a great question. So the reserve study is kind of what I would call jack of all trades type thing. So you're looking at roofs, you're looking at asphalt paving, you're looking at stormwater ponds, you're looking at electrical systems, mechanical systems, HVAC, you're looking at everything. Your reserve study provider is generally going to be the jack of all trades type of provider. And they're going to know a little bit about a lot of stuff. They should generally be able to know enough to see a symptom that should be a cause for concern. So if we do an inspection of a building, and like if we saw that concrete spalling that we saw, right? So we saw some symptoms of problems, we're going to trigger, hey, look, you need an engineer to be on site to develop those specifications for repairs, to inventory all of these columns, to design what the repair should look like. That would be well beyond the scope of a reserve study, right? The reserve study provider is going to be on site taking a look at components. If they see symptoms of things, they may be recommending additional work. Same thing with like HVAC systems, right? So the air conditioning systems are not working on the second floor or third floor, or there's some odors or something like that. That's something that a reserve study provider is going to know enough about to estimate a cost for replacement. But in terms of designing or repairing or replacing or function testing those systems, that would be beyond a typical reserve study. Under buried utilities, another thing that's well beyond. A reserve study is going to be a visual inspection. Your provider is going to walk around your buildings. It's going to, if you have flat roofs, get up on the roofs. If you have pitched roofs, probably take a sample look at a couple sections of roofs. Going to generally look at the common areas and look around the buildings, but it's not going to be an in-depth evaluation of any particular component. However, if you see symptoms of things, and your provider would then typically be recommending additional stuff. That's a good question.
So another question that comes up regularly with reserve studies is that, they're 20, 30, or 40 years, depending on the study. So a lot of these items that we've talked about are 50 to 100-year items. When is the right time to start adding those items into your reserve calculations?
Yep, that's a great question. Our general policy in-house is for those long life items, so electrical wiring, plumbing, piping, concrete structures, unless we start to see some symptoms of problems, we will likely not be allocating funds for it. However, if we walk on site and the building is already 50 or 60 years old, and we know that there's likely cast iron piping underground, and that technically would be a 50 to 100-year life item, we know that cast iron piping with heavy tree root growth is going to fail. We're going to start that conversation with the board of directors. Have you had any problems so far? If not, you need to be aware of it, and we're going to put an allocation of funds in here where it's going to be a little more general at that point. We're probably going to recommend some further evaluations and further inspections, that video bore scope inspections. But on the other hand, if it's a brand new community with brand new infrastructure is built in 2021, is it reasonable to start charging residents today to plan for something that might not happen for 100 years or might not happen for 50 or 60 years? There's a little bit of we would typically, buried utilities, brand new community, I'm probably not going to have anything in it. But once a community is 10 to 15 to 20 years in age, I'm going to start having those discussions and start adding those components in it. I want to give the association 20 years or so, 15 years or so to plan for those expenses. But on the other hand, I don't want to start it at year zero when it might not be needed for 50 years. I don't know that it is reasonable to be paying dues that are ultimately planning for that expense and may not even happen for 50 plus years. But that is a great question that a board or a manager should have for the specific community with your reserve study provider. So at least you're aware of what the gaps are. At least you're aware of, well, what's not on this? What are the things that are not being covered on this? But yeah, it's a really good question.
So another question that came in, should the reserve balance include the ongoing cost associated with repeated studies? So is it a reserve expense or an operating expense?
Yep. So we generally do not include reserve study updates, the cost for updating reserve studies in our reserve studies. We will certainly do it if asked. We usually would consider that a professional fee, professional expense type thing. That would be a regular operating expense. However, from what is right and what is wrong, as a nonprofit entity, you're not paying taxes on income. You can pay it out of reserves or pay it out of operating. It really doesn't matter. So we certainly have plenty of communities fund the reserve study updates or plan for reserve study updates within the reserve study itself. That's something that we've certainly done for plenty of communities we work with.
So I know we have one question that talks about investments, and you add investments on the sheet that you showed. This question is getting maybe into investment recommendations, and what type of investments have you seen other than your traditional CDs or normal money markets?
Yep, and I think we actually talked about this several months ago in one of these CAMS webinars. Most all of the communities we work with are going to invest in an FDIC insured product, typically a CD. You can use your reserve study to help determine what length of a CD, what term length of a CD you're going to use. You can see what your balances are, and if you're going to need a certain amount of money for 1 year or 5 years or 3 years, you can help you choose the length of those CDs. We've had a couple of communities. So if we've worked with 1,000 or 2,000 communities, or maybe more than that on reserve studies, I know of 2 communities that invest in some sort of more risky type components where it's either a bond fund or a market fund. I always recommend talk to an attorney. You're taking other people's money and investing in something that is not FDIC insured. I would generally caution against that. Put it in a CD, yawn at night, but know that you're not doing anything exciting, but know that it is definitely going to be safe.
Yes, and I would second that and say, CDs are generally about as risky as we recommend as a company. Now, there are some people that do decide to get a little more risky with their investments and choose outside FDIC insured, but you are using your neighbor's money for different things. So it's something that we definitely do not recommend. Another topic that I see regularly around retaining walls is trees being planted very close to the top of a retaining wall or at the bottom of a retaining wall. Do you make recommendations on the removal of trees when you're doing reserve studies? And can you talk a little bit about tree plantings, maybe as associated with retaining walls?
Yep, certainly. So it's a little bit of a conundrum because when a developer builds a community and builds a retaining wall on typically the lower end of the retaining wall, the municipality is going to require him to provide a visual buffer. Your development ordinances don't want a big, tall 20-foot retaining wall that is visible from the road. They want some sort of natural buffer in it. So they're going to require him to plant trees at the bottom of the retaining wall. We are generally less concerned about trees at the bottom of the retaining wall, assuming they're at least a couple feet away from it. We are definitely more concerned about trees and root systems specifically that are planted directly above a retaining wall. So the way those retaining walls work, there's a geogrid. There's basically a layer of fabric every third, every fourth course of that retaining wall. And it's a fabric that is basically using the friction between the soil to hold that wall in place. Tree root growth can damage that fabric. It can certainly have a negative impact on that. And yes, and if the tree falls from the top of a retaining wall, it's bringing that whole root system with it and probably tearing up a lot of that fabric with it. So yes, if we see significant tree growth, so I'm not as worried about your larger shrubs. I'm more thinking about oak trees, pine trees, large diameter, 20, 30, 40 foot tall type trees above a retaining wall, and basically within that 5 to 10 foot, maybe 15 foot back off of the edge of the retaining wall. That is something we would certainly recommend, not having large tree growth directly above retaining walls. And certainly something that we would look at as part of research study as well.
Okay, a couple of questions rolling in. So long-term items, do you recommend adding repair allowance into your study?
Yeah, it depends it depends. I hate to sound like an attorney. If we're doing a 20-year reserve study and we see something that we think is going to last 25 years, then yes, we're going to put an allocation of funds at year 20 to begin to prepare for that, right? We're going to call it just that. We're going to call it an allocation of funds to replace metal roofing or whatever the component is. And then we're just going to have a discussion in the report. Hey, look, this has an expected useful life of 25 more years. It's going to fall shortly after the end of the term of the study. We've provided an allocation so the association can plan for it. Now, if something has a 40, 50-year remaining life, no, I'm probably not going to include it on a 20-year study. I don't feel like it's reasonable with that many variables out there, and this thing could have a 70-year life. I don't think it's that reasonable to be planning that early for that type of an expense.
Okay, this next question may be out of your scope, but how can we find a qualified person to act as our treasurer? Our board of directors isn't experienced in budgeting. Should we use,
Go find the retired CPA, right? Isn't that the ultimate thing, is go find the retired CPA in your community and voluntold them or voluntel them to serve as the treasurer. Rely on your professionals, rely on your community manager, rely on the CPAs that your community manager can connect you with. Might even be worth it to have to pay the CPA that your manager recommends to come in and have like a 2-hour long training session to help you through that first budgeting process. Just rely on those professionals. It's not, fortunately, with most of the stuff, it's pretty basic math once you understand all the terms and what everything's called.
And I'll just add to that. CAMS, we have a lot of resources to help you with your budgeting. So if you need additional help that your manager may not, be able to provide, lots of different resources within the company that can look at budgeting and, provide some additional guidance, in addition to reserve professionals and CPAs and other professionals that do this type of work. But we do have a lot of resources to help with that. So what is the responsibility of the board in trimming trees that overhang neighboring properties?
All right, I see two questions here that both say who is responsible or what is the responsibility. My immediate answer to any question of who is responsible for what is to consult with an attorney. I can tell you what a lot of communities have done. I can tell you what we've seen done, but if you're going to ask me who is responsible for it, I'm going to tell you talk with an attorney. Trimming trees, I think that if the branch is on your property, you can cut it off, and it is ultimately your responsibility to cut it off. However, if it is a declining tree and you could say it's been neglected, then maybe the neighbor would have a complaint, a legitimate complaint. With regard to stormwater ponds, golf courses, neighboring properties, we've worked with this in numerous communities. I'm always going to defer to an attorney. Work with an attorney, figure out who's responsible for it. There are a lot of different factors, from number one, who owns it on the plat maps. Number two, what do your governing documents say? Number three, who is contributing to it? There's a whole bunch of different things that would go into it that have more legal precedence than engineers or reserve specialists can provide.
Yes, and so we can help provide some guidance on that tree trimming as well. So, but lots of nuances around trees.
Yep.
So if you have a lot of retaining walls, should you include some sort of reserve for risk of failure?
In our firm, our general policy is if there's a substantial amount of retaining walls in a community, we are going to have an allocation for repair, replacement of sections of those retaining walls, acknowledging that, considering the amount of retaining wall failures that we see, that there is a chance that you are going to have some amount of failure of those retaining walls. And in our opinion, yes. And again, this is assuming segmental block, geogrid reinforced with concrete, very typical retaining walls. If it is a wood retaining wall, we're going to be allocating full replacements. We know that that has a roughly 20-year life, and we are going to be allocating full replacement. But yes, if we see a substantial amount of retaining walls, it's something we are going to be including and having an active discussion with the board, with the manager about it.
So we're just past 5:30. So we'll ask the last question, but does a reserve study make recommendations about trees that are too close to buildings? And actually, do all reserve studies, do you make recommendations when you're providing a reserve study for different items?
Yep. So there's certainly been a paragraph I've written plenty of times in reserve studies. If vegetation is in contact with buildings, it is trapping moisture on siding, on brick, on that type of thing. If you have roofs overhanging, if you have trees overhanging roofs, shedding debris constantly on those roofs, it is going to lead to more rapid deterioration. I've gotten in an argument once or twice about, well, we love the shade. And yes, there's definitely benefit to the shade. I just want you to know that it is going to more rapidly deteriorate, right? So if you're willing to pay for a reduced life cycle to have the shade, by all means, right? I'm just stating the facts that yes, trees in close contact with buildings, dropping debris on buildings, trapping moisture against buildings, it's something that is certainly reducing the life of those components and can cause premature failure. It's something we certainly would talk about. But there are other factors, right? I mean, there are other things that go into it as well.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much.
Yes.
Always informative, and we do appreciate your time today. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And again, our next webinar will be on August 12th, and on top 10 mistakes board members make. So
awesome. We appreciate the opportunity, Ben.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.